Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Hey, friendly reminder to download our app on your smartphone. There's so many ways to watch The First. We're on Apple TV now. We're everywhere. YouTube, all the places. But I think the app is the best. I don't know, at least for me. I like watching everybody's shows on the app. And then it's podcasted too, so you can watch on the go. Anyway, it's easy. Download the app on your smartphone. Just search for The First TV, and it's right there. We're going to talk to someone coming up from FIRE in a little bit here, the free speech organization for college campuses, because they've seen this stuff coming for decades. FIRE has. And I want to talk about freedom of speech here on The First for a minute. Read something in Commentary magazine the other day. There's an article about how we need to stop the great unraveling that we are in right now. And we all feel it. No need to outline it in more detail right now. But they had a couple principles of how we need to do that. And the first is they believe in a plurality of opinion in the public square, right? Bring everyone's voice in. That's great. Like the 1619 Project. I don't know any conservatives who have ever been like, you can't say these ridiculous things. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I'm not saying you can't say them. No silencing there. They called for a full airing of available facts and data on every topic, of course. Rejection of cancel culture and everything that entails. I like this one a lot. Clear, bright lines between speech and violence. And they said that we affirm that speech, spoken or written, no matter how egregious, is not equivalent in any way to violence. Similarly, physical violence is not a mode of speech. I want to get back to that one in a second, but I think that's worth sharing. And then the last one is a complete rejection of political violence. Political violence, wrong, every case, no exceptions, no excuses. So I agree with these. So it's a shame they need to be said in a way, but also I'm always for going back to basics. I think that's always a good practice. The most interesting one, again, is the idea that in America today, speech is violence, right, to the progressives. You need to be silenced because what you're saying is dangerous, it's harmful, it causes trauma, right? They're equating it with violence. Also, silence is violence too, right? So your speech is violence and silence is violence because it happens to rhyme. Put that in the category of you can't win. But then also from the left, actual violence is brushed aside as simply peaceful freedom of speech. Oh, peaceful protesters, right? Like committing violence are just peaceful. So like how Orwellian is that? But it's no surprise. Was it yesterday we talked about the DIE statements? Diversity, inclusion, and equity. Diversity is uniformity. Inclusion is exclusion. And equity is discrimination. So it's all backwards. I got another Orwellian phrase from Stephen Hayward. Whenever you hear someone say, we need to have a conversation about X. We need to have a conversation. What they really mean is, you need to shut up about X and agree with me right now in full. It's the opposite of what they say. Remember this tweet? I don't think we ever talked about this. This was sent out by the Penn State Liberal Arts Department a couple weeks ago. It came out when we were doing our radio show. I remember it came in the middle of the day and we read it. And when I first read it, I thought, because I knew the story was it got taken down. And I read it on the air live and I thought, what's wrong with this tweet? Why was it offensive? Why was it dangerous? Why was this speech dangerous? And I read it, and I was like, oh, I bet it's that. And sure enough, it was. So here's the tweet. Do we have throw it up here? So this is Penn State Liberal Arts Department. Dear students, dear black students, your lives matter. Dear Muslim and Jewish students, your beliefs are valued here. Dear conservative students, that's the problem. Your viewpoints are important. Dear Latinx students, you will not find walls here. Female students, LGBTQ, blah, 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 blah. It was the conservative student part. You can't have conservative. You're not welcome here, quite frankly. So check this out. This is from the Penn State campus newspaper about why they took the tweet down. The school faced backlash from Penn State students who found the tweet harmful towards students of color and ignorant of the systemic issues that oppress people of color in the United States today. Student Cassandra Nunez said the experience of conservative students and students of color cannot be presented as equal in any way. Quote, conservatives in the United States do not live in a system that was built from the blood and trauma of their ancestors. A system that continues to put down people who look like their ancestors every day. Amani Murray said, adding conservative students to the inclusivity tweet, the university neglected her experience as a Black woman. Murray said the tweet demonstrated a lack of understanding from Penn State's administration and brought a sense of shame and humiliation to Penn State's communities of color. So that has all the buzzwords there, right? Just in that short paragraph from that article. It's got, so these are systemic issues, blood and trauma. You're neglecting my experience as a victim of a group. Shame and humiliation. He's got everything. The only thing it's lacking is I'm tired. That's my favorite excuse that these Black Lives Matter people give. Things. Oh, I'm exhausted. I'm so tired. I'm tired. Oh. It's got it all right there, though, in just that one paragraph. But the conservative part, no. It's had to be taken down. How dare you put conservative students in the same category? I want to make the argument here in the 5 minutes remaining that I do not think AM talk radio will exist in America for much longer. Think about it. What is the one aspect of popular culture that conservatives control today? What's the one thing that conservatives control? Maybe the first thing that kind of pops to mind is maybe the church. I mean, that's not even true. And even the church, in many ways, is filled with a bunch of cowards leading them. And I don't even mean political issues, just even biblical issues. Church is filled with a bunch of cowards. But I want to say that's a conservative bastion, the church even. Maybe the evangelical church to an extent, but that's not even true. So it's not the church. So the only thing that's left is AM talk radio. That's it. It's the only part of culture that conservatives control. So I think when Rush stops doing his show, and I say that because Rush makes a ton of money for a ton of people. So when he stops doing his show, I think the big media conglomerates will take that opportunity to deplatform. They'll put out this blowhardy statement. You can see it now. We've decided to stop spreading the hatred that's heard on public airwaves across the country, blah, 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 blah. I know Jesse the other day sent a tweet out, said that conservatives are not long for Twitter. I don't think conservatives are long for talk radio either, which is another reason why I'm super grateful for the first here. Why do I see this coming? Well, it's everywhere, right? A silencing of everywhere. So why wouldn't they go for talk radio, right? But just the other day, they called them far right, but we'll say that for another day. 6 people on YouTube, or 6 YouTube channels were shut down. So David Duke of the Klan, Richard Spencer, who's this crazy white supremacist, and then Stefan Molyneux. I kind of vaguely know this guy. I clearly don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's kind of like a race guy. And then so 3 people, and then 3 groups. Like one of the groups is like American Renaissance or something, whatever. So they're taken off YouTube, totally, completely, permanently, forever, which they can legally do. YouTube's a private company. So that happened yesterday, 2 days ago. Reddit got rid of a thread called The Donald. They just shut that down. Twitch is an online gaming website. It's owned by Amazon. They suspended the president's stream the other day. Reddit wrote this blowhardy thing about they have a ban promoting hate based on identity or vulnerability. What is that? What is vulnerability? What are you talking about? Remember yesterday or 2 days ago, we shared the story of Jordan Peterson about a physics professor who was denied a grant. His paper was unpublished, and they had to apologize and everything because his statements violated the journal's policy on trustworthiness and social awareness. Like, what does that? What does that mean? You violated social awareness, or you had lack of social. What are you talking about? So same thing here. Oh, this promotes hate based on vulnerability. And then Twitch said hateful conduct's not allowed on Twitch. They took off the president's stream. So listen, this is they got you in a double bind here, all right? Because they put you in a position where you're supposed to support David Duke, right? But here's the problem. The umbrella of what's considered hate speech is so broad, it's literally anything that makes anyone uncomfortable. Remember the other day we talked about inclusion. That's what inclusion is in the woke newspeak. It's anything that makes anyone uncomfortable is excluded now. It's not allowed. And even your mere presence, if it makes someone uncomfortable, then you're not allowed. Hate speech is so broad, you have to come to the defense of anyone who's being denied access because of their speech. That's the problem. H.L. Mencken had a great quote. He said, the trouble with fighting for human freedom is that you spend most of your time defending scoundrels. For it's against scoundrels that oppressive laws are first aimed. And oppression must be stopped at the beginning if it's to be stopped at all, right? So if you come to David Duke's defense, you're defending David Duke. If you don't come to David Duke's defense, then it just feeds the beast, and then they keep going, and then it's you. Everything we do on this show is considered hate speech by the left. Every single thing we've ever said is considered hate speech. We had Hans Feeney on yesterday talking about the gospel. That was dripping with hate. If you want it to, if you're a progressive and you're looking for it. We talked about forgiveness and redemption and forgiveness yesterday with Hans Feeney. Redemption and forgiveness. Oh, the hate on Slater's show. True story. It's unbelievable. Got to shut that down. It's so hate-filled, right? Absolutely, people will make that argument. Every single thing you hear on the first is hate speech, if you want it to be. So if you got to defend everyone who's under that umbrella. Unfortunately, that's the double bind you're in. Eric Weinstein, he sent this tweet out. He said, I have been relentlessly critical of Molyneux, Stephen Molyneux or whatever. He frightens me. But if his worst views on race frighten me understandably, it is YouTube and the CEO of Google's corporate views on thought and expression which truly shake me to my core. It's not even close. So what's worse? These guys' racist views or corporate views on shutting down thought and expression? If you don't defend the scoundrels' right to say things, then the left will just go after Mount Rushmore. Did you hear that yesterday? They're going after Mount Rushmore, right? Calling that racist and violating tribal lands and whatever. And they're going to go after Mount Rushmore because they can't speak for itself, right? Mount Rushmore can't speak for itself, right? So they go after the scoundrels, they go after the statues, and then once the movement has sufficient momentum, Here's the other reason I think we're not long for AM radio. You hear this big boycott thing that's going on? So Target's now joined the mix. There's big corporate boycott of Facebook. Big companies. Last I checked, it was 90, but it's got to be way over that now. So companies like Coca-Cola, Verizon, now Target. I mean, these are big, massive companies. Patagonia, REI. They're not advertising on Facebook anymore. And I remember I first saw that the other day. I was like, why? I wonder why. Maybe it's not working, or I don't know. I didn't know why they were shutting it down. Well, here's why. This is Unilever. Unilever owns a bunch of shampoo companies and also ice cream companies, randomly, are there? Unilever joins brands like Eddie Bauer, North Face, Patagonia as part of a campaign forcing the social media network Facebook to more stringently police hate speech. Again, that's you. That's me. That's everyone here on the first. This is Levi's. Facebook must take actions to stop misinformation and hate speech on its platforms. It's an unacceptable affront to our values. We and Dockers are joining the Stop Hate for Profit campaign and pausing all ads on Facebook. So add them to the list. Again, no one's for hate speech per se, but today hate speech is anything that makes anyone uncomfortable. And specifically anything that challenges the progressive Black Lives Matter cult narrative. Why isn't tearing down statues of George Washington considered hate speech? Anyway, right? Or saying conservatives aren't welcome on Penn State's campus. Why isn't that hate speech? You'll be silenced next. You're being shamed into silence right now. You'll be forced into it next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to get right to our next guest, who is a man and from an organization who saw all of this stuff that's going on in America right now coming from decades away. Robert Shibley is the executive director of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Robert, how are you, brother?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to talk to you. So real quick, before we get to this Title IX story, can you speak a little bit to this? A lot of people thought that all the stories you guys highlighted for so long on college campuses would stay on college campuses, and now those kids have graduated, and we're seeing the fruit of that. Can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, I think you put it well at the beginning. This is something that FIRE has been warning about for a long time. One of the things that one of our founders, Alan Charles Kors, who is a professor at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, said was a nation that does not educate in liberty will not long preserve it and not even know when it is lost. And that's been on FIRE's T-shirts for 20 years. And I think we're starting to see that come to fruition now as the students who have gone through the university and even the K through 12 system, not really learning these lessons, not understand. Now they're out in the world. They're starting to take on, either activism or sometimes positions of power. And they don't know why we have the values that we do in terms of respecting people's right to have different opinions. And so, it really is the very predictable outcome in many ways of what we're seeing.
Reaping what we've sown, no doubt about it. We could go in a million different directions, and I want to get to the Title IX story, but if you could point to one, and there's many, right? So it's not the one, but one thing from the last few decades, or one principle that we abandoned, or one thing we didn't do and should have done. What's one that you think, if only we did that?
That's a good question. Frankly, I think the main one thing we should have done was, this may sound trite a little bit, but I think it's worth remembering to remind people about the golden rule, which is really the principle that underlies a lot of this, that you need to treat others the way you would want to be treated. And when it comes to free speech and the First Amendment and due process as well, that's the, treating people fairly. You've got to put yourself in the position of the people who would be there and say, what would I want if I were in that position? And it seems like that's very rare among people these days.
Nothing trite about that. I'm always for going back to basics, and that's perfectly true. Assuming the best, I think, is a part of that too, right? Everyone assumes the worst of everyone else's argument, but everyone wants their arguments to be assumed to be the best. Right, assume the best of their argument, but they assume the worst of everyone else. Great answer there. All right, let's get to this Title IX case here. So back it up here. What is Title IX? We've all heard it before, but what's a good definition of it?
Title IX is the federal law that prevents sex discrimination in federally funded education programs. And that includes all K through 12 schools pretty much, except for private ones, and virtually every college and university, public and private, because Pell Grants and Stafford loans, which almost everybody has, some part of federally funded loans to go to school now, count as federal funding. And so Title IX says that they cannot engage in sex discrimination in those programs. Since then, it's been expanded from the original meaning, which really the main concern when it was passed in 1972 had to do with colleges that didn't admit women and things like that. Now there's very, very few of those, obviously. There are very few single-sex colleges at all, and almost no men-only colleges. And for a long time, it was really applied a lot to athletics. So when I was growing up, mostly when you hear about Title IX, you'd say, oh, this school has a varsity team and crew for women, but not for men, things like that. But the underlying really problematic part has been that it's also been interpreted to deal with sexual harassment on campuses, but it was never intended for that. And so it's sort of grown over the last 40 years into what it is. Through court cases and various guidance from the Department of Education and things like that. And so these Title IX regulations are actually the first regulations since actual regulations that went through the whole regulatory process since 1975 when they were put in place. So it's been that long since somebody actually sat down, went through the whole process and said, how do we actually want Title IX to work on college campuses?
Wow, is there any chance that Title IX could be used against schools to admit more men? Because I'm sure you know the numbers. I don't know them offhand, but it's something like women are getting well above the majority of degrees. And some majors, it's like 70, 80% of the degrees. And even PhDs, women earn more PhDs than men even. Is there any effort to have equity among the genders in that regard in favor of men?
I don't know if there's an effort to do that. I do think that it's actually you're right that there's a risk. I know that a number of universities, major ones, have 60% women and 40% men. And generally speaking, that never is allowed to go over 60%. Which suggests that there is some kind of effort there to limit the number of women who are actually being admitted to universities, which is suggestive anyway. I don't know if there's any effort to do that, but I think it is suspicious that that's as high as it would go.
You can make a Title IX argument that we need to use it to help men, not women. Anyway, back to this point. So sexual harassment. So how's it been used lately for sexual harassment cases? And what's the latest effort here?
So this sort of pile-on for sexual harassment really started in April of 2011 when the former Department of Education put out this letter that people now just call the Dear Colleague letter, because it started Dear Colleague, talking about how schools should handle sexual harassment cases going forward. And it required them to use the lowest possible standard of evidence, the preponderance of the evidence standard, which is like a 50.01% certainty standard, and also allowed accusers to appeal if the person they accused was found not guilty. But there was a lot more sort of to it than that. It really kicked off a big effort. And we saw more and more lawsuits filed by students who said they were falsely accused. We saw more and more people coming out and saying this process is a joke. And so when the new administration came in, they decided they were actually going to go through the proper regulatory process and decide, okay, how do we actually want to have a meaningful and equitable Title IX system? And that's where these regulations came from.
Okay, so what's your hope through this?
Well, our hope, we think the regulations are actually very wise for the most part. They really impart a lot of they're new protections to Title IX, but they're actually not new at all in real life. For instance, we've been doing a survey of the top 53 U.S. News and World Report schools, and more than 70% of them never actually said you were presumed innocent until proven guilty. Many of them didn't actually give you proper notice of what you were charged with doing, or might have unnamed witnesses who were testifying against you, or they would not let you actually have a hearing. Very few of them had guarantees that the hearing board, your judges, actually had to be impartial. It's sort of one after another, all of these really fundamental things that not only would all of us expect if we were in it, but we would all expect simply from watching TV shows about court dramas and things like that, are totally missing from these Title IX procedures. And they're trying cases as severe as forcible rape in these conditions. So you can be found guilty of felony crimes, guilty in the school sense, but it does mean expulsion, under a process that nobody would accept. In fact, some schools got rid of the hearing completely and just gave it over to a single investigator who would just talk to whoever they wanted to talk to, maybe not the people you said, maybe not even all the witnesses, and decide who was guilty. That became very common under this scheme.
And then is the argument that a male student's not only kicked out of school, but maybe couldn't get accepted to a different school? I mean, life ruined is a dramatic way to put it, but what's the problem with all this?
Well, these things would go on your transcript, and if there may be schools that are willing to take chances on people who have a notation on their transcript that says they were found guilty of sexual assault or forcible sexual assault, or even just a sexual harasser. Why would you want that person at your school? Why take the risk with all the other people you could take who don't have that on their record? So. Does it ruin your life? I guess it depends on whether or not your plan for your life depended on you going to college. If so, then it definitely did.
Yeah. So what's the petition? You guys have filed a petition in federal court. What does that say exactly?
Yeah, so this is sort of some legal inside baseball stuff, but it's important. So the Department of Justice is tasked with defending any regulation that the federal government puts out. But there is a process called intervention where other groups can come in on either the side of the people challenging the regulations or the people who want to defend the regulations, saying, hey, court, we have other things to say as well. For instance, FIRE and our coalition groups, we're actually making an argument the government won't make. The government is the government, and they would like to have as much choice as possible for what they do. And so they actually are not saying that a lot of these protections are required by the Constitution or required by law. And we want to make the argument to the court that not only do we think this is a good policy, we actually think it's required to follow the First Amendment.
Yeah.
You are defining sexual harassment. The definition of sexual harassment that the department had been using under the former administration was actually that any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, including verbal conduct, which is speech, is sexual harassment. That means if somebody overhears a dirty joke or any kind of sexual related joke, even one just about women and men or something, and don't like it, technically that is sexual harassment under the federal government's former definition. We don't think they should be allowed to go back to that. We think that's a nightmare where everybody, if you overhear one thing, you can complain, and all of a sudden the other guy's in the dock and on trial for some kind of sexual harassment. It makes it meaningless.
Well, it makes sense. Everyone's a victim, right? So the broader the definition, everyone's a victim of hate speech and or sexual harassment at all times. Crazy. Okay, I want everyone to go support FIRE, please. You guys are a fantastic group, and so for a long time, way ahead of the curve. Finally, hopefully people can listen to everything you guys have been saying for a long time, because we're seeing it right now. Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Robert Shibley, Executive Director of FIRE. Robert, thanks. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk again. Keep us updated. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to admit I have been woefully inadequate in my Supreme Court analysis and following this last week or so. There's been a ton going on, so I haven't been able to read these cases like I normally really like to do. But I'm grateful, therefore, for Amy Swearer from the Heritage Foundation, legal fellow over there, whose job it is to follow this and then also talk down to us and explain it. Amy, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Very good, I'm glad you're here. So let's start with some Second Amendment stuff. What do we need to know about the Second Amendment here?
So not a whole lot going on at the Supreme Court in terms of Second Amendment, but I do have an op-ed out recently that I think is really worth people reading and getting to know, especially given the rise in new gun owners over the last couple months, possibly millions of new gun owners. So every month at the Heritage Foundation, at the Daily Signal, we do a series on defensive gun use. And I think it's important that in the process of highlighting all of these good defensive gun uses, we also find a lot of stories of gun owners who do things wrong, who act irresponsibly. And so I think there's a lot to actually learn from these stories that we don't highlight about how to be responsible, sort of what not to do, namely things like don't confuse vigilantism for defensive gun use. You're supposed to use your guns defensively. Once you start actively chasing criminals and taking on that sort of cop role, that's not a right or duty that you have. Things like investing in responsible gun ownership, training, taking professional training, knowing what the self-defense laws in your state are so that you don't end up as a national news headline for the wrong reasons.
Totally right. We have a gun sponsor on my radio show, and it's not just about owning a gun. It's knowing how to use it and when to use it and when not to use it and being a responsible gun owner. There's no doubt about that. And there's so many people who just rush to buy guns, and they could be potentially dangerous unless you do the right thing. No doubt about that. What's the Supreme Court, what's on the docket or potentially coming? Because it's been a little while since we've had one, right?
Supreme Court case or Second Amendment case? Yeah. So unfortunately, a couple weeks ago, the court actually denied certiorari, so declined to take up and hear, if you will, all of the remaining Second Amendment cases on the docket. So it's possible that another cert petition comes up between now and the fall when the court comes back for its new term, but it looks pretty unlikely. The court sort of had its pick of the litter this month, a bunch of really, really good opportunities, and it didn't take up any of them for next term. So it's unlikely that they're going to find a better opportunity. And it looks like they just really didn't want to take one up. And it's been, as you mentioned, about 10 years now since they've taken a meaningful Second Amendment case.
Yeah, that's an overlooked part of the whole Supreme Court process is they decide what cases to and not to take, right? And there's a ton of power there, obviously.
Absolutely. Because essentially then what it does is it allows lower courts lower circuit courts to sort of rule the roost there. And for 10 years, unfortunately, what we've seen in some circuit courts is undermining the Supreme Court's precedent in cases like Heller and McDonald, and essentially saying, okay, fine, you said you have an individual right to keep and bear arms, but we are going to make it as narrow as possible, regardless of what you actually said in those cases. And until the Supreme Court takes up one of those cases from those circuits and sort of, strikes back at the circuit court saying, no, we really meant what we said. The Second Amendment is important. You do have to respect it. Unfortunately, you have a lot of Americans in a lot of states who don't have an equal right to keep and bear arms as people in other places.
Yeah. Well, anyway, good conclusion that all of us need to be responsible gun owners. Don't ruin it for everyone else by not being a responsible gun owner. But I was hoping that the whole Second Amendment debate would be over for good now, because you have so many even liberals who went out and bought guns and see the need for what happens, at least to own a gun during social unrest, if nothing else. So I hope the Second Amendment debate is over, but alas, that's wishful thinking. Amy, I know you follow this abortion case from the Supreme Court. Can you give us the overview of what happened there?
Sure. So I think it's important to start with the factual background here. A lot of people misconstrued this case, thought that Louisiana had imposed restrictions on women seeking abortion, had added barriers to the abortion right itself. But actually what this was a health and safety law. It was quality control for doctors performing abortions. So it basically would have brought them up to the same standards as other doctors who perform similar types of outpatient surgery. So it would have required them to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, so that if something went wrong during the procedure, which this is a very serious outpatient surgical procedure and things do go wrong sometimes, they'd be able to go with the patient to the hospital and treat them at the hospital. And it's also a quality control measure because there's some peer review process and sort of quality control standards that go into getting those privileges. So that, unfortunately, was the law that was struck down as unconstitutional. So again, it wasn't a barrier for women seeking abortions. It was actually quality control for doctors, sort of this idea of, well, didn't we want safe abortions to begin with? And so it kind of strikes at the heart of that argument by holding doctors to a different standard for abortion.
Yeah. And if you say it's healthcare, let's treat it as actual healthcare and not something different. Why? So what the argument from the abortion providers would be, it was too oppressive, it was too high of a standard, it was too expensive of a standard to meet, and therefore limiting access to people. Is that what that was?
Right. So essentially what they said was, well, it's too hard for us to get it, even though when you look at the record, they didn't try very hard to actually get these admitting privileges. And there's a long history in Louisiana of abortion clinics having very, very low standards, training people like radiologists and ophthalmologists. That's an eye doctor to perform abortions, something you'd never see in other aspects of outpatient surgery. And so this law sort of went at that. And basically what they said is, this is going to make it too hard for us to perform abortions. There's not going to be enough abortion doctors for women. And so therefore it's going to be harder for women to get abortions. But it was sort of this hypothetical, we're never going to be able to get these privileges, even though we didn't try.
So what did our 6-3 conservative Supreme Court rule? Why did they rule against Louisiana?
So this actually ended up being a 5-4, but it was really 4-4 and then Chief Justice John Roberts. So the key player here was the Chief Justice. So this hinged on a case from 2016, so not that long ago, where he had actually said, look, I think this is bad law. He disagreed with the court with the majority in 2016. And then he actually this week said, and I still think this 2016 case was wrongly decided. But instead of voting to overturn precedent in that case or explaining why this is different from that case, he said, well, I'm going to apply this case that I thought was wrong. So essentially, the Chief Justice looked at this and said, I think it's wrong. I think this law should be constitutional. But based on 4-year-old precedent, I'm going to uphold it anyway.
Precedent is such a weird thing. I don't get it, because you hold to it, but then you don't hold to it, right? I mean, like, there's horrible precedents that were set by the Supreme Court that obviously you overturned, but then it's also used as the argument, well, you can't overturn it because it's precedent. I don't get that. What's the point of that even then?
Yeah, and so there is sort of a framework for when courts should and shouldn't overturn precedent. But I think what's interesting here is that this is, again, only a 4-year-old decision from this 2016 case. The Chief Justice, within the last couple of years, has voted to overturn precedent in much more entrenched cases, things that were decades old precedent. That he voted to overturn. And in this case, it looked like he was just very concerned with that people might look at this and say, oh, the court's politicized. It's a 5-4 decision striking down abortion, or striking down the right to abortion. Yep. And he was just very worried about politicizing it. But it's ironic because in the process of doing that, he actually did politicize it by taking into account political opinions.
Wow, it's interesting too that it was his precedent, right?
Right. So this was something that he had actually disagreed with in 2016. He did not sign on to that majority opinion. And he still, in this case, in the Louisiana case, said it was wrong then. I still think it's wrong today, but I'm going to apply it anyway, which is a bit mind-boggling.
Okay, let me ask you this last question about Roberts. Listen, they're still people, right? I mean, these are still human beings with their own persuasions and biases and all these other things. Just because they put on a black robe doesn't make them any different than any other people. So what are the motivations you think? I'm going to ask you to get in the mind of Chief Roberts. What's his deal? What motivates him? What drives him? What do you think his influences are that make him lean the way he does on certain things?
Well, look, I'm not a mind reader any more than you are, but I do think it has become fairly obvious that the Chief Justice is very concerned with the image of the court, of people. He's very wary of people viewing this as a political institution. And it really does seem that sometimes that plays into his decision making and sort of how he votes and reasons in cases more than it really should. When you think about what a judge is supposed to do, he's not supposed to take into account political opinions. He's not the legislature. He's not the executive. He's the judge. He's supposed to say what the law is based on what the text and meaning of that text is. So it's just very interesting how he views the image of the court and tries to protect that. At least that's what it seems like. Again, I'm not a mind reader.
Totally. No, I'd love to hear him speak to that. Because there's definitely another variable at play, it seems. Amy Swear, always appreciate you. Thanks for being our expert. Heritage.org and then dailysignal.com. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
We're talking about Atlanta coming up next. What's been going on there these last few weeks when we defund the police and the police pull back. It's coming up. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Saturday Crusaders. Yesterday, we talked to Pastor Hans Feeney on the show. He was amazing. I went back and I've re-listened to it twice now because it was so thoughtful and deep and engaging. Please check that out everywhere, on the app, YouTube, everywhere we are. You can watch it on demand. I want to share this tweet from Hans Feeney. He said, "Patriarchy is good. We need more of it. There's no such thing as not having a patriarchy. You either have a good one or a bad one. We currently have a bad one. We should replace it with a good one. Good patriarchy protects your businesses from rioting thugs and sends people to Siberia for bringing their kids to Drag Queen Story Hour. Bad patriarchy doesn't do that. Good patriarchy uses masculine strength to defend the weak. Bad patriarchy uses masculine strength to exploit them. A good example of that is yesterday also talking to Jaco Bujans about sex trafficking in America. There's a patriarchy there that perpetuates a $32 billion a year industry. There is a patriarchy. It's a bad one. A good one is like Jaco, protecting the vulnerable. Society rots when men are not strong, brave, and virtuous. We've lost the last two, brave and virtuous. May God bless us to recover them. Everything we've been saying, remove God, then culture, and then family, or in this case, dads, and you get everything we're seeing right now. Everything. Couple that with not only not teaching our history, but actively preaching that America is bad, inherently bad at our core and at our founding bad and evil, and everyone who came before us is evil as well. Of course, this is what's going to happen. Of course, what we're seeing now is the end result. How could it not be? We've neutered boys and men, told them the patriarchy is evil, have our girls wear these shirts that say the future is girls or whatever, right? And what did we think would fill the void? You tell boys and men that you're inherently bad, get rid of the patriarchy. What did you think was going to fill the void? You think we eliminate virtue, neuter men, eliminate the patriarchy, teach our kids that America's rotten and evil to the core. What did you think? I was going to usher in utopia? Thought everyone was just going to magically start loving each other after you do that? We'd have peace and harmony among people and races? Atlanta City Council. They had a virtual meeting the other day. And they have a council member who represents an area just west of downtown. And he was getting ready to speak. This was a council meeting about public safety. So the police chief was there. It was all virtual, but the police chief was there. And this is what the council member said. Right before he started talking to the chief, he said, Chief, I was just notified there's a young man who was just shot and killed at 377 Westchester Boulevard. Can you get a unit out there? He's been on the ground and there's no police who have come. He's dead already. He's on the ground and the residents have put a sheet over him and the police still haven't arrived. That was at a city council meeting. This is like Afghanistan? Like what? You heard it. We've all heard, of course, about the Wendy's burning to the ground in Atlanta. Remember last week or whatever? A couple hours before that, unrelated, different part of town, but a couple hours before that, there was a shootout. 5 people wounded, 2 killed, 40 gunshots. A bar earlier in the month in Atlanta posted a picture of bullet holes in the side of the front of their business. And they wrote a post that said, we're closing until the city gets its blank together. Friday, police in Atlanta found the body of an 80-year-old man in his home. A couple days before that, there was a drive-by, 20 shots fired, and no one knew that one of the bullets went and killed this guy sitting in his home. Over this last weekend, there were 3 drive-bys, 6 injured in Atlanta. Check this out, the first 3 weeks of this month, all right, so the first 3 weeks of the month, May 31st to June 20th, 75 people were shot in Atlanta. Last year over the same period, it was 35 people. More than double. Last year, same period, 5 people were killed. This year, same period, 11 people were killed. Should note here, these are not police shootings. These aren't police officers shooting people. These aren't white people killing black people. There's not like these like white marauding bands of Klan members terrorizing black neighborhoods. These are black kids killing black kids. And it's especially high now. Like the fact that there were 35 shootings last year is crazy, right? And that's because you've removed God, culture, family, right? That's 35 is crazy high, right? But now we're looking back on that as like the good old days, right? So that's crazy high. But the reason it's especially high is because you've removed the last fail-safe. That's the police. And now it's just game on. There was a 2-week period this month. Last year, the city made 1,100 arrests. This year, 310 over the same period. Police did not make a single narcotics arrest last week in Atlanta. It was like, do whatever you want. It's over. Just game on. The final fail-safe has been removed in our cities. Now, this is Atlanta. Chicago's way worse. This week in Chicago, 6 kids were killed, shot and killed. 6 kids, a 10-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old. Insane. This week. But whatever. No one cares about those black lives. Those black lives don't matter. Have you seen this video? Have you seen the video from Ami Horowitz? I'll give you the gist of it. He goes to New York City and talks to some white people about defunding the police. And they're like, oh, the police are the worst. The police are awful. We've got to defund the police. They're murderers, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes to Harlem. And he asks people if they want to defund the police. And the black people in Harlem are like, no, what are you kidding me? Like, it'd be even worse than it is right now if we get rid of the police. The police are great. We love the police. My brother's a police officer. My family member's a police officer. Yeah, I'm against police brutality, but we need the police officers around here. The police officers are for the people. The police officers are of the people. This is one that, LA, they just got rid of their, are starting the process of community-based police force or something like that to respond to calls unarmed. But I look at the community-based part, and you're like, what do you think the current police officers are from? I think like we imported them from Spain or something? Like, what are you talking about? They're from the community. But anyway, this idea of defunding the police, that's a luxury belief, as our friend Rob Henderson coined. Defunding the police, it's a belief mostly held by upper class or very comfortable middle class privileged white people to abolish the police and add it to the list of policies and ideologies that hurt black people. Defund the police, welfare programs, public schools, toxic music, abortion, add to the list of all of these people, usually upper middle class people, white people, who support these things because they think they're helping. And in fact, they're destroying. Chicago, just the other day, there's a 19-year-old who shot and killed a 17 and a 16-year-old after they asked him how tall he was. The guy's 6'3", killed him right there on the street. It was 5 p.m. Any justice for Justine Francis and Charles Riley? Any marches for these kids? We need to bring the good patriarchy back. True story. Mike Slater. We'll be back tomorrow. Spread the word.